Bien, bonjour, bienvenue à l'IMéRA, enfin, si je puis dire, bienvenue sur un écran à partir de l'IMéRA. Au moins, nos invités et quelques résidents de l'IMéRA sont là, dans la salle un petit peu clairsemée, parsemée, mais au moins, on va pouvoir partager ce moment-là à distance. Et donc, nous sommes dans les séances de cet atelier de recherche que nous avons conçu et que nous animons de concert avec Dionysie Albera et Mohamed Tosi, que je salue, je sais qu'ils sont connectés. Et donc, nouvel moment de ce rendez-vous. Nous avons proposé cette année pour thématique à cet atelier de recherche de l'IMéRA, qui est soutenu par Amidex, l'initiative d'excellence d'Aix-Marseille Université. Donc, nous avons choisi ce thème de partager l'universel entre partage des langues et partage des mémoires. Alors, dans son beau livre « Éloge de la traduction », Barbara Cassin observe que l'universel est toujours l'universel de quelqu'un. Et c'est pourquoi, ajoute-t-il, je m'en méfie tellement. Un universel situé, un universel partagé, un universel à l'épreuve des langues et de la traduction. Et elle ajoute ceci, la traduction est aux langues ce que la politique est aux hommes. Et à propos de l'universel, Barbara Cassin cite volontiers Hannah Arendt à propos de la pluralité des langues pour faire l'éloge de cette chancelante équivocité du monde. Je cite cette phrase qui est dans les cahiers de pensée d'Hannah Arendt. Cette équivocité chancelante du monde et l'insécurité de l'homme qui l'habite n'existerait naturellement pas s'il n'était pas possible d'apprendre les langues étrangères. D'où l'absurdité de la langue universelle contre la condition humaine, l'uniformisation artificielle et toute puissante de l'équivocité. Et donc, c'est une invitation à apprendre les langues étrangères et donc à traduire de la littérature en général et de la littérature arabe en particulier. Et donc, c'est tout le sens de cette séance. Nous avons parlé le mois dernier de la lingua franca avec l'historienne Jocelyne Darclia et le philosophe Noureddin Afaya. Et donc, on avance dans le cheminement des langues avec un accent particulier mis au cours de cette séance sur la langue et la littérature arabe. Et pour cela, nous avons la chance d'avoir deux invités de marque. Iman Mersal, qui vient d'Égypte et du Canada, qui est la titulaire de la chaire Camus cette année à l'IMéRA, et qui va sortir un livre bientôt en français, traduit par Richard Jacquemond, la recherche des El-Zayat, qui sort au mois d'avril chez Actes Sud. Et donc, Richard Jacquemond, qui est traducteur au long cours de la littérature arabe, qui a réfléchi sur ces enjeux, qui enseigne la littérature arabe à Aix-Marseille Université et qui dirige un laboratoire partenaire qui est l'IREMA, l'Institut de recherche sur le monde arabe et musulman. Et donc, ça va être un dialogue à deux voix entre eux, suivi évidemment de discussions. Nous leur poserons des questions et vous pourrez évidemment, pour autant que nos liaisons numériques marchent, soulever des éléments de questions, de réactions. Nous avons du temps devant nous. Et donc, cette séance va avoir lieu en anglais, qui sera notre lingua franca pour cette séance, et peut-être aussi de temps en temps un petit peu en arabe, parce que leur langue commune, leur lingua franca, Richard Jacquemond et Iman Mersal, est évidemment l'arabe. Donc, ils ont construit un duetto, un dialogue à deux voix. Donc, je leur laisse tout de suite la parole. Je crois que c'est Richard Jacquemond qui va commencer. Donc, je vous souhaite une bonne écoute. Pensez à couper votre micro pendant le temps où ils interviennent pour éviter des interférences de son, de téléphone portable ou de choses de cet ordre. Je sais qu'il y a un certain nombre de doctorants qui sont inscrits. Et donc, après l'intervention, avant la pause, je ferai une petite appel pour, effectivement, parce que je dois vérifier ceux qui ont pu participer à cette rencontre. Je vous souhaite une bonne écoute, de partager l'universel entre langue, littérature et traduction, entre langue arabe. Et donc, tout de suite, la parole à Richard Jacquemond et à Iman Mersal. À tout à l'heure.
Bonjour, cher public lointain. Bonjour à vous à qui j'ai déjà dit bonjour ici. So I will switch to English for Iman's sake. And I hope I won't lose anybody in the way because I'm not so much used to speak about these subjects in English. So translation, Arabic literature, universal. Do we say universal in English, Iman? I don't know no, in English. I mean, we have this word in French, universel, which we use a lot, littérature universelle, universelle. In English, universal or global?
Depending if you are using the political term, I think you will say global more. The
Yes.
humanistic one, universal.
Universal, okay. So
English
yeah, we're into literature, but we're also into politics because, as you are going to notice, I will also talk about politics of translation, politics of literature, and the word they use most in English actually when they talk about global or universal literary production, they say world literature. There's a lot of debates in American academia about what to teach in world literature. What is world literature? What belongs to the world and what doesn't belong to the world? And the point is, as often when you talk about the world in English or of universel in French, it has actually very limited. You talk about a very limited world and a very limited universal, and especially as regards literature. World literature is actually mostly literature written in European languages. And nowadays, there's a lot of struggle and fight and people striving to widen this notion of world literatures in order to make it really inclusive of all the world literary traditions, but still there is a lot to do to achieve this goal. Ah, tiens, oui, d'accord. Ah, mais je suis pas, je suis pas allé de. Okay, I'm starting to switch to Arabic. This is really problematic. Okay. So world literature and world literature has been for a long time and still is to a great extent is European languages literatures. If you look at, I just made the check for this talk. You look at the list of the Nobel Prizes and you single out the Nobel Prizes of literature of writers who don't use European languages. And that's 7 out of 120 and 117. So like 5%. You have 2 Chinese, 2 Japanese, 1 Arab, 1 Hebrew, and 1 Turkish or 1 Pamuk. Yeah, that's it. translating Arabic literature, whether it be prose or poetry, whether it be modern or classical ancient literature. There's a big challenge here into, this is what I'm talking about, how to include this literary tradition and this literary output into the world literary canon, into the world market, to put it in other terms. If you look at the French position in this market, it looks quite favorable. There's this database at the UNESCO, which is called Index Translationum, where you can check the number of translations that are published from language into another language, from different languages too. And you can have also statistics of which language translates more from which language. And you discover like that currently, that is in the last 20 or 30 years, French is the language that most translates Arabic. You have more translations from Arabic into French than into any other language, whether it be English or German or Spanish or Turkish or Indonesian, because these are translation languages from Arabic for religious matters, of course. But this is very small numbers, like it counts for roughly 2,000 titles on a very long period. And if you look at the share of Arabic translation in the translation market in France now, this is around 1% of everything that is being translated into French. Taking into account that 2/3 of the translation market is taken by English, translations from English into French. And of course, Arabic is not the only language that is suffers from this kind of marginalization. It's also true for many small European languages and other world languages as well. But yet that's the situation. So that it means that you have very small space for Arabic translation into French. And then if you look at what is being received into French, there's a kind of sociological rule that is that the less a language is translated, the more you are prone to find that there's one genre that dominates those translations, which is the novel, which means that little translated languages, what we get to know from them is mainly only novel. And what we read from those novels is, when we read them more for to get information, documentation on those countries, those societies, rather than for purely literary interest. This is what we read in French or in English, or we read Arabic, modern Arabic literature, for what Sinan Anzoun, distinguished Iraqi American writer, calls forensic interest. To get information about these people, these weird societies, these weird people, rather than, and therefore the question of the universal is doomed to be failed in these conditions. I give you a few examples of this. I have okay, I will stay to one example, and then I will switch to poetry. One example about how translated Arabic, modern Arabic literature in translation is generally received in France or in the West. There is one bestseller in modern Arabic literature in translation. It's the famous world bestseller. It's Alal Aswani's novel Avec Iman Mersal, and it is a bestseller for these obvious reasons also. It is a novel, and this is why I was telling you when you want to get acquainted about a place you don't know and a society you don't know, so you're going to read a novel rather than a book of history or whatever. It's a novel. It's a nice, easy storytelling, and it's full of information about Egypt. The review of Ahmad Jacobian in Le Monde was written not by a literary critic or a literary journalist. It was written by Gilles Kepel, who is a French political scientist specialized on Islam, well-known figure in France and abroad, maybe. And the title was the title of the review was Un concentré des tensions du Moyen-Orient. That is a concentrated version of the woes of the Middle East. That is the title of the review of Jacobian in Le Monde. So this is the way this literature is commercialized, received, and I'll give you a more personal example. I am the regular translator of a distinguished Egyptian writer, who is Sonal Ibrahim. I have translated 8 novels by Sonal Ibrahim. Sonal Ibrahim is he was, before becoming a writer, he was a communist militant activist, which sent him to jail. And in jail, he decided to quit politics and to become a writer. And because in Egypt in the 60s, there was simply no room for political activism. And as I say in my research work about writers and politics in Egypt, in many cases, turning to literary writing was a way to continue politics through other means. So Sonal Ibrahim became a writer, and he is a writer with a political agenda, and he is also very innovative in terms of writing. He is considered one of the people who have most transformed literary writing in prose writing in Egypt within the 60s, what we call the 60s generation, and furthermore. And he's an important writer. Most of his writings deal with a critique of the current politics and in Egypt, and the way the country and the society is leading towards Islamicization and bigotry and consumerism and so on. The novels that were more successful in France in translation were precisely the novels where, when you read them by Sonala, you get the more information about the country. I think especially about Z, Elizabeth Z. In the 90s, he wrote 3 novels les années Z, Sharaf, Warda, we were very much social, historical novels, also very interesting on the literary side, but full of this information. And those were the novels that made his name in France as a politically committed writer and someone who has something to say to us about Egypt. Then in 2005 or 6, I translated his latest novel, which was called El-Talassus in Arabic, Le Petit Voyeur in French, which caught much less attention from of course, we sold a bit because he had already his audience, but in terms of criticism and interest, was much less. And because precisely this was a novel that didn't say anything new about Egypt, the Egyptian society. It was very intimistic. It was a novel about his childhood. He had a very particular childhood between living alone with his father because his father had married a second wife, a young lady who was the nurse who was taking care of his first wife who was getting sick. And Son Allah is the son of the second wife, who was a young nurse who became crazy and was sent to a psychiatric hospital. And Son Allah, between like 5 and 15, was raised by his old father. And the novel is about this childhood, this child discovering the world in the company of this old father. And it is a very moving novel, and Iman is nodding because she likes, she enjoys the novel. And I think it's maybe Son Allah's most important novel, or one of the most important novels, but yet in French translation, it did not interest much the audience. I will switch now to poetry because Iman is a poet and she will also talk about poetry. But before giving you, I finish my presentation with universal and the poetry. I have a very funny quote to share with you about translation of Arabic poetry, modern Arabic poetry into French. The two, you know, the two main poets, most well-known Arab poets, Mahmoud Darwish and Adonis, and it is a very beautiful example of how to deal with this question of particular and universal and politicization of poetry and reception. On the one side, you have Adonis, who is the example of the successful poet, Arab poet, who succeeded in universalizing himself, and first of all, by changing his name into Adonis, which is Greek, therefore universal, and then settled in Paris and pursued his career as a poet, mingling with world poets and presenting himself as equally critique of the East and the West, and building up on Sufi tradition as well as Western tradition, as well as Chinese or whatever, and universal, the successful universal poet, who is therefore the eternal non-chosen candidate for Nobel Prize. And in the title of the introduction of one of his most well-known collections of poetry in French It's in the Poésie Gallimard series, which is the one series of poetry that is selling and that you can find in any public, in any bookshop. And this introduction is by André Velter, and the title of the introduction is L'exilé universel, the universal, the global exilee, which is because that's the way. If you're an Arab poet, that's the way you have. That's what you have to do if you want to convince the world that you are not an Arab. You have to present yourselves as universal. Now, the other most known poetic figure in France and worldwide, Arab, is Mahmoud Darwish, which is exactly the opposite. I mean, he has he made his name both in the Arab world and outside as the poet of Palestine, which is the local, particular, and the contrary of the universal. And that's the way he was presented first in France, when he started being translated by Abdelatif Labi, Moroccan Francophone poet, who was also very much of an activist for Palestine in the 70s and 80s. And Labi published an anthology of Palestinian poets, which was the first translation into French ever of Palestinian writers in 1970. And then he went on translating Darwish in the 70s and 80s as the Palestinian cause poet. Then Darwish, at that time, came to live in exile in Paris and became conscious that to be recognized as a poet, he had to get rid of this etiquette of being the poet of Palestine, and he had to become the poet of the universal also. And he started working on that, and he stopped being translated by Labi. He became translated by Yas Sanbar, who is a fellow citizen Palestinian, but living in France. And he was also published in the same Poésie Gallimard series, with an anthology in 2000, which is called La Terre nous est étroite, which is from the title of his famous poem Tadir Bin al-Ard. And he wrote himself the introduction of this collection of poetry. And the title of this introduction is Le lieu de l'universel, the place of the universal. And in this introduction, Darwish makes a very conscious effort at talking about himself as a poet, and almost not mentioning the Palestinian aspect of it, talking about poetry and the earth and sentiments and nature, but the word Palestine is almost absent from the introduction, which is very interesting. How so this is the predicament of the Arab poet in France. I think I have talked enough for the time being, and I'll let you keep on, Iman.
Hello, everybody. I want to share a few questions about translating modern Arabic poetry into English today with you. And in order to start, I would go to actually Milan Kundera. And if you ever read The Unbearable Lightness of Being, you would come across this scene. Milan Kundera, a writer in diaspora, puts Sabina, a painter in diaspora, in the position of the diasporic artist who is facing the imposition of ready-made identity. Kundera writes, Sabina had once had an exhibit that was organized by a political organization in Germany. When she picked up the catalog, the first thing she saw was a picture of herself with drawing of barbed wire superimposed over her. Inside, she found a biography that read like the life of a saint or martyr. She had suffered, struggled against injustice, been forced to abandon her bleeding homeland, yet was carrying on the struggle. Her paintings are a struggle for happiness, was the final sentence. She protested, but they did not understand her. Do you mean that modern art isn't persecuted under communism? She said, my enemy is sketch, not communism. Why I'm starting with this scene? Because actually it highlights for me personally the whole process and the industry of translating Arabic poetry into English. This is not to undermine the great efforts of translators and some small publishing houses and so on and so forth, but I'm looking at translating Arabic poetry in English in general since its beginning in late 50s when Arbery made his first anthology of modern Arabic poetry. So this scene with all of its relation is central to ask the question who translates and why and when. Therefore, I would start today by clarifying what I mean by the catch. And I will give an example of it from translating Arabic poetry into English so that we can think about it together. I'll tell you the story of Ashraf Fayyad. Ashraf Fayyad is a young Palestinian poet who is a refugee, his family from Khan Youssef, but they became refugee in Saudi Arabia. He was involved in some cultural activities, writing poetry and interested in arts and so on. He was persecuted in 2015 and sent to death by being beheaded. And of course, there was a very big outcry all over the world from human rights organizations as well as writers and cultural organizations. This outcry did something good for him. They changed the sentence from beheading and death to 8 years in prison and 800 lashes, I think. Yeah. So what happened with this? This big outcry is completely understood. I mean, to defend someone's rights somewhere in the world against a law that is coming from a medieval time. But what happened with Ashraf Fayyad is different since we are talking about poetry. His actually poetry was translated right away. To tell you the truth, I knew his crisis, his melodramatic story, but I never knew his poetry. But his book was translated into English, French, and among other languages. The book was translated by so-called instructions within by the Operating System Press. The Operating System Press, when I went to its website, they introduce themselves as defenders of human rights and justice. They don't talk a lot about poetry. The book came out, it was translated by Arab and non-Arab translators. Here it is, and Laabi translated him into French too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and this is really what I might call the urgency of translation. And the urgency of translation for me is a catch. And I'll clarify both because I'm not using catch here as a completely negative word, actually. I'm just using it to try to express how I think about it. So let us see this urgency of translation and the catch. In this kind of translations, the authors are trapped behind barbed wires. And this is why they are calling for urgent translations. Ashraf Fayyad is an example. Sabina in her in front of the German organization is another example. Does this mean that there is no barbed wire? No, there is more than by barbed wire. The guy was going to be executed and sent to death. So there is actually an important reason to pay attention. But this translation was made just because of that. I don't think if he was not subject of this persecution, he would be translated. Urgent translations risk creating a kitsch about victimization. How did I know that? Because I tried to find anything written about Ashraf Fayyad poems, and there is nothing. It's all about him and his story. It's about him as a victim. Richard gave us also an example of how, introducing a text as a novel as a social document, or introducing a poet here as a victim, and that's it. So I'm not really judging the quality of his poetry, because I'm not a police officer who would tell you what to translate and what not. But if the publishing house and the book is into the world without any talk about which school, which generation, a favorite poem, whatever. So it's not here at all belonging to poetry, as much as it's belonging to a bigger issue that we, I think, understand. So is there an ethical imperative for such kitsch? Yes, of course. If I am in the position of the translator and the publishing house, I would do the same, I guess, if I can, because saving someone's life is more important actually than publishing a poetry book. All right. Such kitsch is not a postmodern phase of Orientalism, in my opinion, but it's a production of an asymmetric relation between two cultures. But I just want to move with this a little bit, because there are so many talks from Walter Benjamin to Spivak to a specialist in translators about the power relations, and that we have center and peripheries. We have first world and third world. It's all true. But we have really to pay attention to how this power relations is taking different shapes in different historical moments. So just to give you an example, when I looked at translating Arabic poetry into English, it was a big lecture for American University in Cairo for their translation center in 2019. I worked in this for a few months. I found out that you can really look at first national anthologies of poetry, selection of modern Arab poets by Arbery, for example, in 1948 and then 1950. But until 1970, as Roger Allen is telling us, when he wanted to teach Arabic literature, the only anthology he had in 1970 was Arbery anthology. But what happened after this was really amazing. Between 1967 and 1973, some interest started to show up in Arabic literature, especially Palestinian literature. If we look at the translation of Arabic poetry, you will find, for example, that the most translated poet ever into English is Mahmoud Darwish. The most numbers of an anthology connected to one country is Palestinian poetry, but it's not enough. If you look at the whole, either national Arabic poetry or regional, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Palestinian, and so on, or poets, individual poets, I found out that you can see waves. So for example, 1973, lots of Palestinian poetry. During the Lebanese civil war, we started to see anthologies of love and wars, love and blood, and so on. With Arab Spring, another way of introducing Arabic poetry, poets who were in the squares, fighting, all right? And and of course, there is something about Arab women, which I might touch later. So the kitsch and its barbed wire have no limits in language or genre, because we can talk about this in translating Arab novels into French, or actually Brazilian or Indian, or so many other languages. I mean, lots of Indian writers write in English already. But if you go to look at what they are translating from India into English, it's all the same. It will be something that is a social document, or telling us about something, or because there is a big event about this struggle between different minorities. So let's publish one book from here and one book from there, and so on. So no matter how fallacious the catch, every text enters the conversation within the language it's translated into. This is really what I want us to think about. Even Ashraf Fayyad, even if it's not great poetry and it's translated for a different reason, but somehow it enters the conversation about maybe Saudi Arabia or Palestinian refugees somewhere, or the idea that the center is saving the peripheries from some of its melodrama. So if really I'm not against kitsch, urgency translation in this case, so is there where is the dangerous in kitsch then? It is actually a big dangerous step because from my experience as a writer and as a teacher at university, I can see the problem of urgent translation, because it gives you an idea that this is the only poetry out there. This is one of its problems. And it can't enter an internal conversation inside the language in which it has been translated. So for example, I would discuss Jacobian building when we talk about social classes in Egypt, gender, poverty, cosmopolitan downtown Cairo, right? But we don't, as French writers, sit together and talk about the novels that are changing our feeling of the world, and then mention this novel or that. This is my problem, actually, because if you are translating for emergency all the time, you miss lots of good literature, and you paint a picture of a particular culture as if this is what they have, or you read any literature from this culture expecting nothing in terms of beauty, humanity. It's about them, not us. And this is really a bigger problem than translation, because I mean, when you read in the West, and I have been living in Canada for 20 years, and I see people read translations from all over the world, it's usually reading a book that was created elsewhere. And elsewhere is defined by its politics. It's what we know about it, right? So the elsewhere is usually actually a bad place. It's under totalitarian communism. It's where women wear veil. It's a place where there are civil war between minorities, and so on and so forth. So a reader is reading this book. He has a good intention to know about the other culture or other country, but the same reader doesn't find really lots of non-fiction books to help him understanding the other culture. And his only way is this literary text, which its function is moving from being literature to be a social document. Also, when you have this emergency translation, you impose a particular identity over the poet. So I, myself as a writer, I ask myself sometimes, why do I'm translated into this language or that? Like, who reads me, right? You want people who are interested in poetry to read you, not people who are interested in Egypt or Muslim women or women of color or so and so. So you feel you want to fight this imposition of identities all the time. How do you fight it? You discuss how to write your bio with your publisher or translator, for example. Like, you know, I'm not a victim of anything, alhamdulillah. I want you to write something about the book, you know, that for readers of poetry, not individuals who are interested in Middle East or not. Okay, so when I talk about the dangers of kids, we really here, it's a very important issue for the center as much as it's important for the peripheries. Why? Because the center needs also to internalize other people literature inside its conversation. Why do you think that an Egyptian writer can't write a fantastic book? I mean, there is no reason to deny good literature or great literature coming from elsewhere. So in order to have this internal dialogue and to bring the others, which are us in this case, into your conversation, you have to treat, I think, literature differently and to distinguish between urgent translation and translation for this internal dialogue. Also, there is one problem that I never understood, but actually just yesterday, I saw this interview with Kevin Kishore, who is a publisher of Seagull books in India. It's a very short interview, but it's very inspiring. And this is why I add, is there a translation along the peripheries? I mean, south-south. So Seagull bookstore in India is actually translating into English some of the best literature worldwide, right? Without having to wait for big publishing house in US or France or to publish bestsellers books. From Arabic, for example, they published Haitham al-Wardani, they published Yasser Abdel Latif. I have a book with them. it's an ad. So what Kevin is saying, basically, he said, we translate Arabic, literature from so many languages, including Arabic, of course. But if this book is translated in US, it will be republished in British or translated into French or Japan or wherever through English, right? However, because this publishing house is in India, and because they have a particular selection of books, their books are not really well distributed. They are not also republished somewhere at all. So he was talking about the problem also in what you might call the third world or peripheries, that we don't translate each other. We wait actually to know what is the best novel from its translation into English and the French first. So we don't, even if you translate from Korean literature, or Japanese, or it has to come through one of the two languages, English or French. All right, I have lots of things to say, but I will end actually. I made a very sophisticated PowerPoint, so this was supposed to be one by one. So, but there is a trouble in technology. I'm asking actually these questions, and I lit it for our discussion. I'm not going to, to answer them or anything. I'm just asking, what is the importance of translation into colonial language? So I really am fascinated with this, because I feel sometimes that we, for example, Arab writers, it's as if translation is usually to one of the colonial languages, not any other language, as if the other language will be one language, but one colonial language is so many languages. So this position is really interesting to discuss. What makes translation into colonial language different than being translated, for example, into Bengali or Persian or whatever. Who is translating? The translator, publishing house, and institution. From my study, I can elaborate on this if you have questions. From my study of translating Arabic poetry in English, I found actually that individual translators who are selecting poets and poems because I like it are the ones who really contributed to translating Arabic poetry into English, while institutions usually use what fits a political conversation around. Also, we can talk about differences between Arab translator of Arabic poetry into English and non-Arab translation, and what are the differences in their choices of what to translate. How to present the poem and its author. I think, Richard, you talked about this, how to introduce really the two good examples of Adonis and Mahmoud Darwish, and there are so many other examples, some of them are even funny. Who is the intended reader for translation, print and marketing? I'm really interested here in seeing the whole thing from the classroom, within the classroom. I teach Arabic literature in English, so I have to teach poems. And it's all the time very easy for me to teach poems of Mahmoud Darwish or Adonis, because the conversation is ready. Students are usually interested in history and experience, and they would know something about Palestine, and right away we are reading poems about struggle, about the concept of land, about being in exile, blah blah blah. It's very easy. Adonis, of course, as soon as someone read a poem of him like The Death of God, oh, he is a Nietzsche follower, there is a ground to meet Adonis even, and his use of mythical, and epics and all of that. Anyway, but I have experience of teaching one of my favorite Arab poets is Sarkun Boulos, who is an Iraqi poet. I'm not sure if he has been translated into French.
Yes, that's a collection. Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Sarkun Boulos.
Yeah. So when I teach Sarkun Boulos, we have like 2 minutes of silence a time. Like, we read the poem and it's like waiting for a conversation to start. Who will start it? Oh.
It's okay. So, yes, one interesting point about this universal, particular Arabic, French, English, post-colonial, whatever translation is the place of women's work into translation. There's much interest into Arab women's writing in much more than anything else into translation. Being a woman is already an asset when you want to be translated from Arabic, and this gives very funny covers, book covers. I have selected those 3 because I think they are particularly telling about how the market works. You have the classical veiled woman translation for which is the translation of Banat al-Riyad, Les filles de Riyad, girls from Riyadh. On the left, do you see it? Est-ce que vous voyez?
Ouais, mais on voit pas les 3. On voit qu'une, on n'en voit qu'une et demie là, je pense.
Voilà les filles. Là, ça y est.
Voilà.
Ok.
Merci.
Voilà. Merci. Voilà. Ok. Là, vous les avez, hein? So this is the way the Arab women writing is marketed usually. On the left, you have the idea of the veiled woman and who is going to give us a confession about what is happening behind the veil. And the text, the back cover of the Les Filles de Riyad is particularly telling also. I will read you a bit of it. Blah, 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 blah. Where is it? Le livre choc qui a secoué le monde arabe. Publié au Liban en 2005, ce livre a d'abord circulé sous le manteau en Arabie Saoudite. Pour la première fois, une romancière aborde le sujet tabou des relations des filles avec leurs fiancés, leurs maris, la façon dont elles peuvent vivre leurs amours sans transgresser la loi. So these are all the words that you will always find into this kind of marketing, taboo, transgression, behind the veil, and shocking, and so on. The second book is Salwan al-Naami's La preuve par le miel. It's an interesting thing about Les Filles de Riyad is that it's a novel also. It's totally fiction, but then, as you can see on the French book cover, it's presented as a document, as if it was non-fiction. Well, it's pure lie. Anyway. La preuve par le miel. So you have the other kind of cover, which is the naked woman's body, which you can see here, la belle chute de rein. Je ne sais pas comment on dit chute de rein en anglais. It's a novel about a woman who a kind of sexual or sentimental sexual sensuous education of a woman who reads back old erotic Arab treatises. And then I put in as an example of a normal cover Iman's book, which is going to the one which is going to be published next month in my translation. It's Iman's investigation of the story of this woman, El-Zayat, who is an Egyptian writer who committed suicide in 1963 after after not being able to publish the one novel she had written, and this novel was published posthumously in 1967. Iman read it in the 90s, and she was fascinated by this novel and by this character, and then she embarked like 20 years later into a long, several-year-long investigation on who is she and what happened to her, why did she commit suicide, and why did her book disappear from the literary Egyptian canon, and so on. And this is a very wonderful book, a very moving story, very beautifully written, and I like this cover also because you see a woman who could be Egyptian, Italian, French, whatever. It's a picture of her, a little bit blurred, a little bit, which gives the idea of this woman who is like a ghost, who is no longer here, but she still haunts Iman and everyone who is going to read the book. And I think it's a beautiful cover, and it it allows us to forget this sad marketing of the Arab woman, either as veiled or a sexual object. I will also give you a few words about stop the share, arrêter de partager. Okay, so that you can see Iman's previous book in also my translation into French. It was published 3 years ago. It's an anthology of poetry because Iman was and still is first a poet. She has published 5 or 6 collections of poetry, among which I have made the selection which was published under this title, Des choses m'ont échappé. And I won't embark into a presentation of her poetry. I wouldn't be able of doing so, but also I will just mention that it was the first collection of poetry in this series by Sinbad by a woman, because also there is this gendered thing about poetry. Poetry is the highest literary form, is considered in the Arab world and in many cultures, and still for us as the highest literary form, and therefore it has been traditionally reserved to men rather than women, and women are good for storytelling. You know, women are Shahrazad. They tell stories, but they don't. They are not supposed to write poetry. And
oh my God!
What is this?
I don't have a copy.
Okay.
All men.
All men, yes. And it was also the first Egyptian, because modern Arab poetry has flourished rather more in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria and so on than in Egypt, or that's the way it is perceived, at least. So this is something interesting also. And now, if you want to know more about Iman's poetry and work, I will leave it to you to ask questions, and we can open the discussion.
Can we ask questions now, or do we have to wait?
No, okay.
Go ahead.
Ask question.
Okay. In English, then.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. How will? So I had just one question, but before that, I just wanted to show you, Richard, that it's not only for women, this kind of book covers, because I don't know if some of you, I don't know if you can see very well what I'm showing you. It's
yes.
Probably some of you have already read that book, which is a kind of autobiographical essay by a French Algerian writer called Mohamed Kassimi.
Mm-hmm.
There is also a Moroccan painter with the same name, so be careful. And
yes, okay.
It has absolutely nothing to do with love or sex or ever. And this cover has been chosen. And he told me that when the book came out, he discovered that there was an erotic library in the town of Lorient in France. Really, it's not a joke. And probably there was a confusion. So they decided to put this, they chose that book cover, which is particularly elegant and far from stereotypes.
I was the publisher of the book. I was strictly against this cover. It was not possible to change it from Actes Sud.
I don't know who's talking.
It's and
okay.
I know the story very well, but it was the same idea with also the book of Al-Asfi, and it was very orientalistic when they did one of the book, and it was the same. So it's a real struggle for the cover.
Yeah, okay. And I had a question about Iman's novel, although I really want to read it, but Richard, you said that it disappeared from the Egyptian literary canon. Did you say that?
Mhm.
Something like that? I was just wondering what do you mean by
Iman can
no, not Iman's book,
Inayat's
book.
Inayat's novel. Why did Inayat's novel did not make it to the literary canon?
Yeah.
For example, can you buy it today in Arabic and can you read it?
Yeah.
Iman,
Okay. So do you hear me?
أهلا يا إيمان.
Yeah. Hey. So the novel, as Richard said, was published 1967. And when actually I found it on like a street bookseller in Azbakia, where they sell lots of books, for a cheap price. I was a master student then looking for a particular book. So I found this novel and I read it and I was so surprised because I studied Arabic literature as I was doing my master. And we all we know is Latifa El-Zayat as a big figure in Arabic modern Arabic literature. This is the first novel talking about her novel Al-Bab al-Maftuh, or the open door. Usually it's in wherever you study or discuss literature, this is the first real novel written by an Arab woman, because it brings together the national subject with the good writing, the formula of Arab novel, right? And of course, we can talk about how Latifa El-Zayat, I mean, it's a beautiful novel, but the Yasar or left wing, Arab in Egyptian culture was very important. So who was publishing newspapers or writing about literature, usually committed writers. So when Latifa El-Zayat wrote her novel, it's perfect because it talks about personal identity, female personal identity and national identity, colonialism, and so on. So I never heard Inayat El-Zayat name in any book about Arabic female writers or Arabic novels or whatever. And I'm talking about 1993. So I started to ask older writers, do you know her? Some people said, we never heard, her name, but some told me, for example, that they read the novel, but they didn't know who she, or they heard that she is half German, lots of, rumors and also weird information. I'm talking about asking the sixth generation, not younger people. And so one of my questions in the book was why her novel was excluded. In my opinion, it's not less than The Open Door, but it's different. The Open Door has a discourse about the nation, while Love and the Silence of Inayat El-Zayat is really, you are in front of a young woman who is whispering, who is depressed, who is interested more in internal journey and understanding than activism. And this was really fascinating to see why this novel was excluded until when my book was coming out in November 2019 by Al-Kutub Khan, and Al-Kutub Khan was preparing the novel to be reprinted for the first time, but another publishing house, because there is no rights, it was published in 1967, published the novel 2 weeks before my book. My book on the traces of Inayat El-Zayat came out. So this was the first time that her book is republished.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shukran.
Is there other question? Tu peux le faire d'ici. Non, j'ai fait pour moi. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres? Is there other question?
Yes, maybe, but there is an echo.
Yeah, it's all right.
When you
try
speak.
to solve it. It works now. Now. Okay. Ask your question.
Yes, I'd like to return to the beginning when both Richard and Iman, I salute, spoke about the reception in translation of Arabic poetry, and with this what kind of privilege which is given to Adonis and Mahmoud Darwish, so that as if there was a kitsch. Iman said it was a kind of kitsch, the urgency or emergency of literature as a kind of kitsch. But I would like to say that even if we go in bookshops in Arab countries, and if we are looking for poetry in bookshops, I don't mean in downtown in Cairo or in Street Al Hamra in Beirut, but in most of the places we can say that we find all the works by Darwish, and most of the time we can find Adonis. And I would like to suggest that this selection, which is operated in translation, also exists in the poetry by the poets we can find in the bookshops. I think that, of course, what do you think about that, Iman, of course? And it's not only in translation that we find mainly Darwish and Adonis, but also there are references in the Arab world itself, of course. Mm-hmm. And there are, yes.
So thank you very much for the comment and the question. I just want to distinguish between what I meant by urgent translation or catch. I was talking about Ashraf Fayyad in particular, this kind of translation. I'm not included Mahmoud Darwish and Adonis in them. Mahmoud Darwish and Adonis are different story. I was talking about who is reading the poetry, and can we internalize this kind of poetry coming from elsewhere inside the center, inside a Canadian university where I teach literature, for example. So I just want to clarify that there is a difference. It seems that, in my opinion, really, I feel like kitsch is important. Kitsch is important, meaning it can open doors sometimes. And if some people are interested in this kind of literature, they might be later more interested in a different kind of literature coming from these cultures. And it's necessary sometimes, such as if translating Palestinian poetry will put a light on Palestinian struggle, I mean, who would be against this? Our problem here is really when we don't distinguish between things. It's the same way, like when people were, my friends, for example, used to say that Yaqubian Building is a very bad novel. No, in my opinion, it's not a bad novel. It's a kind of novel. It's a genre. It's interesting novel to read. But don't think that this is the highest literature this part of the world is introducing. This is a problem. Do you know what I mean? Hello?
Yes, I understand the difference between the when you spoke about the reception of Ashraf Fayyad, and it's very different from but this polarity you spoke about, both Richard and you, this polarity between the specific, which with Darwish, who could be Darwish could be seen as a specific writer of Palestine. Of course, he didn't want to be only that. Mainly when he was in Paris. and Adonis as the universal poet. So what I wanted to say mainly is that this polarity and this inequality in the representation of the between these two parts and the other Arab poets, from Sargon Bolus to everyone. I mean, or everyone, all the forest. I mean, there are two trees, and the forest is behind. Don't we find in the debates also in until now? I mean, do you find this polarity not alone only in translation, but also? That was my question. Also, I spoke about the bookshops in Cairo, on Beirut, but not only in Cairo. I mean, if you go in Tunis or in Algiers or everywhere, if you go to the place where there is poetry, there are the full works of the complete works by Darwish and sometimes by Adonis. Though what I wanted to say is this.
I understand you
yes,
now.
Yes,
yes,
that was my question.
Yes, I understand you now. You are trying to say basically, if we go to an Arab bookstore, or even if you ask 10 readers of poetry in Arab world, maybe 7 out of them would tell you that we like Mahmoud Darwish. Mahmoud Darwish is the best poet we have, right?
Yes.
Or Adonis, or yes. Because, I mean, but this is different story. The story here is, in Arabic poetry, there was always, almost always, a political and the question of identity and modernity, basically, either it's political directly or not, was really in the heart of Arabic poetry. So when we talk about Mahmoud Darwish or Adonis as a poet is a prophet, right? He is the one who has vision, who can tell us about how to see the world around us, and even about our identity, and so on and so forth. So this prophecy dominated Arabic poetry, modern Arabic poetry, because the question of colonialism, modernity, women's position in society, dictatorship, and it goes on and on until today, right? So it's true that these big names are dominating the literary scene in Arabic poetry. When you translate, you should have translate good poets who are representatives of particular language, like Adonis and Mahmoud Darwish, and this is true. But why some other poets like Sargon Bolus, who didn't have actually a collection in English until Penny Bell made a very Penny Bell in London, made a very short, collection of his poems. The guy was even living in Los Angeles. Most of his, since 1969 or so. So when you see this example, you feel a little bit weird. Also, when you see lots of Arab poets are translated by Arab institutions inside Arab country, and this is something no one really discusses. We know the Porta project, which Salma al-Khadra'i al-Ghiyushi established to translate Arabic literature. She made 3 anthologies, I think 1 in poetry, short stories, and selections from novels. And it's a huge amount of money, big project, lots of translators into English were working in it, right? But you have also some cultural institutions inside, for example, Syria, that used to translate Arab poets into English. And these books were not distributed anywhere in the earth. الهيئة العامة للكتاب in Egypt would translate the worst poetry in the history of modern Arabic poetry. And it's in Coronation Mill in Cairo, like these books don't go anywhere. But you have also Emirates and Saudi Arabia, where they actually are paying the big publishing house to publish their own poets. And if you compare the numbers, this will be big amount of translation than what Western institutions are doing, plus individual translators are selected. Do you know what I mean? So I really think it's more complicated than, there is no an evil mind in the West that is doing bad things to Arab culture or any other culture. There is power relation. There is also the inferiority of certain cultures who think that being translated into colonial language is more important. And there is a preference playing role in pushing this kind of literature or not to be translated from their own canon into other languages. This is what I want to say. I think it's more complicated.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I hope I answered. Richard.
Yes, also, yes, the picture is much more complicated, and thank you, Iman, for adding some of this complexity. One very interesting point about French translation, and I think it's also true to some extent as regards English translations, is the importance of the migration networks. When I mentioned that Darwish was translated by Abdelatif Labi, a Moroccan poet living in France, and also and later by Elias Sanbar, also Palestinian historian and intellectual living in France, exiled in France since the late 60s. And there's this whole Arab intellectuals and poets, Galea community who live in either in France or in Great Britain or Banipal. You mentioned Banipal. Banipal is a project which was created also by a couple, and part of the couple is an Iraqi writer, Samuel Shamon. And all these figures have played a very important role into there's this concept we use in translation studies about export translation or import translation. And much of Arabic poetry, especially Arabic literature in general, Arabic poetry especially, has been translated into French and English through export translation. That is, the Arabs exporting themselves rather than European importing them through these kinds of channels. And also, poets, exiles, they open publishing houses. They have publishing houses. They have opened, founded publishing houses in Paris, in London, in the States. They direct series. The most important series in France is directed by Farouk Mardambe, who is himself a distinguished Syrian origin, Arab historian and intellectual. And it's thanks to him that Actes Sud actually publishes a series of Arabic poetry. I think because otherwise such a publisher wouldn't care about publishing Arab poets who nobody knows and nobody cares about, because this kind of book don't sell much, as you can imagine. So this is a very complex picture we have to draw. Yes.
There is a question.
Yes.
There is a question by Ines Bourlif. I can tell you, recently there has been a polemic over translating Black poet Amanda Gorman by a person of color. What do you think about that, Mr. Jacquemond? You translate Iman Mersal, a woman writer and sometimes on woman topic, do you think that a woman could have translated it differently? Or these ideological criteria have no place in the translation? And it raises also a question of universality about translation. Reaction about the translator and the poet.
So I was just trying to tell the story about male translators and female translators. So I have a book entitled How to Mend on Motherhood and Its Ghosts. And this book has been translated into few languages. One of them is in English. And I worked with Robin Meager, like he translated it, but I mean, we exchanged questions about it or notes when I read what he translated and so on. And I found in one particular area that it was very difficult for him to translate me in the way I want, or the text. I was talking about giving birth, the feeling, the woman feeling crack from within because she is giving birth. And of course, when you write in your own language, you are in control. I mean, you can, without realizing, you choose this word, not this word in this piece. And you realize that this is actually more feminine than this when you are talking about giving birth. But in English, there is nothing, right? And actually, it was great for our relation and as well as for the translation of the book, me and Robin Meager, to discuss this and to share even, our ideas about it. So it might be a problem sometimes, actually. With all of my respect to my dear Jacquemond, but it will be worse if someone who doesn't relate to your writing experience translate you, even if it's a woman. This is also my experience. Do you know what I mean? So in English, my poems are translated by Eric Ermesby, Khalid Mutawa, and Robin Creswell. And actually, I had a very bad experience with a female translator who tried to put a collection of my work in English very early in 2004 or so. I did not like the way she was translating me. She was making me more sentimental than I am in Arabic. I mean, I believe in poetry that is anti-sentimentality. I want the language to be very economical and transparent almost, right? This is the way I think about or feel about poetry. But this great translator was trying to make my poems more effective or sadder or some metaphors here and there, and it didn't work. So you can find worse. It's okay to be translated by a male translator, I guess, if he understands and feels the poetry. Why don't you come here? Don't use this. It's a hassle. Come.
If there's other questions, reaction?
Yeah, sorry,
Pauline?
I just had a question for Stefan. And it was to follow up on what Stefan was saying about the landscape of translation of Arab literature in France. It seems that the key figures that translate and promote Arab literature in France are no longer spring chicken, particularly within the publishing houses. And this, coupled with the current dynamics of the book industry and the fact that you have less and less students in France learning Arabic to be able to translate, an increasing number of students learn Arabic because of geopolitical reasons. What do you see for the future of, what kind of future do you see for translated Arab literature? Are we going to have less and less, for instance, less authors being promoted and translated, or are we somehow strong enough to maintain the level, the particular level France has experienced in terms of volumes of works of Arab literature being translated? I think we're one of the biggest countries in the Western world publishing and translating Arab literature compared, for instance, to England or to other countries. So what do you see for the future?
Me?
I can.
It's a question for like all the for you, Iman, and Richard as well.
I really can't imagine if poetry will survive in the future. Poetry itself. I mean, sometimes we like to feel that at least poets would think that poetry is so important, and whatever happened in this world, it will continue to be the supreme art, you know, for some people. But when you think about it, everywhere you feel that the poetry itself is facing a big problem in terms of readership, right? Novel is more important at the moment. The readership of novel is a way bigger than poetry. But when I think about translation, I feel seeing young people who are studying Arabic and trying really to like, you can see a new generation, at least in North America. I don't know France, because I see in conferences and so on, young people who are doing their PhD in Arabic, who lived in Syria or Tunisia or Morocco for a few years and so on. You feel they are really knowing the map of Arabic literature inside Arab countries very well. And this gives you some hope that whatever they will translate, they can translate whatever they want, but they know the position of this text in its map at least. So they know that they are translating it, even if for different reasons, but they know its position in its own culture and readership.
I like your question. I'll try to bring my own grain of thought to add to Iman's answer. When I compare the situation now and like 20 years before, I would say like sure, there's the biggest change is not in from our side. I think when you look at the translation market in France, Arabic translation market, who is translating, who is publishing, and how things are going on. There's no change at all since almost since the 90s till now. I mean, the numbers are roughly the same. The publishers are roughly the same. The public interest is more or less the same, that is close to nil, and so on. And you would think that things, big events like the Arab Springs, that would have some impact on this. Actually, it has no impact at all. It just helps to remove a little bit the interest from one place to another. Like, for instance, before 2011, you had almost no Syrians translated into French or English. Now there are plenty of Syrians translated, and it's a good thing. And also a little bit the same for Iraqi literature, and so a little bit less of Egyptians and Lebanese, which were dominating in France, but no big changes. I think the most important change, and I'm not worried about the future, even if you're right, Colin, the state of Arabic studies in France now is not very brilliant, and we can be quite pessimistic about many developments, but yet there will always be a good translators and publishers and people interested working into this small niche, because we're talking about a niche, but this niche will still be here. What is the most, what worries me more is that now the difference between now and when I started, when I was working like 20 or 30 years ago, it was back then it was easy to decide that you had 2 or 3 good novels that were being published every year all over the place in the Arab world, and 2 or 3 poetry collections. And now it has exploded. Now there are writers everywhere, from Morocco to IMéRA to Syria, and the publishing market is much more lively and diverse than it was back in the 80s or 90s.
Right.
And now it's much more difficult for me, and I think for anybody, for you also, maybe to keep in touch with what is being published around the Arab world, because it's so diverse and lively, and so it's much more difficult now to follow up, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps also the like the new waves of like publishing, and particularly like on the internet, have removed some traditional intermediaries, including publishing houses and also translators, because some people would just like just spread their content online. Sometimes there would be an automatic translation. Obviously, for particularly for poetry, it doesn't like pay justice to it. But yeah, so perhaps also translators might have a hard time trying to like fit in also these new waves of being published. That was just a concluding note on my side.
Other questions? Il y a de nouveaux messages là, il y a peut-être. Could you tell us if there is any projects of publishing bilingual edition of poetry? Well, if you look at what's available on in the French market now, half of the current publications are actually bilingual, because and most of them are, especially in poetry, because poetry, it's very interesting to publish poetry in bilingual editions. Yes, and
so who is published in bilingual from Arabic?
But
if you look
Darwish,
at
yes.
Huh?
Yes, but you know, in Arabic, who is translated in bilingual editions. You find classical Arabic poetry mainly, the mu'allaqat and poetry from Al-Andalus. That's and there is also an anthology, the anthology of by Mahmoud Darwish, which is bilingual, but I don't think there is a lot.
Yes, there is a lot, but it's in small publishing houses, and several poets Arab poets living in France now who publish their own poetry in bilingual editions. But
not in Arabic, in Italian. Was translated in Italian and French.
Any other? If there's no more questions, then we will.
It's very difficult to exchange it this way. Not being together. I would have a lot of questions, but
what can we do
like this?
So I just say a word. Sorry. Many thanks for you. It's quite difficult to have a real exchange. I hope the next appointment is on the 13th of April. Le 30 avril, ce sera sur justement les questions de mémoire et sur la question autour du génocide arménien, avec un regard turco-arménien de Cengiz Aktar, qui est un politologue, un intellectuel turc qui est aujourd'hui exilé en Grèce parce que sinon il sera en prison, qui est un de ceux qui est à l'origine de la pétition pour la reconnaissance de la grande catastrophe du génocide arménien en Turquie, autour de la fondation Hrant-Dink. Et donc, il devait y avoir Michel Marian, qui est aussi un intellectuel arménien qui vit en France et qui travaille sur ces questions, mais il a des soucis de santé, il ne pourra pas être là le 30. Ce sera un de ses amis qui travaille aussi sur les mêmes questions, qui s'appelle Gérard Malcassian, qui lui est philosophe. Et donc, rendez-vous le 30 avril pour notre prochain atelier à 14 h. J'ai noté les doctorants qui étaient là à travers leur nom, donc ils seront mentionnés. Merci de votre écoute. Et effectivement, ça nous permet au moins d'échanger pendant 2 heures avec tous les soucis divers et variés qu'on peut avoir, mais au moins, ça nous permet quand même d'avoir ces moments-là et de partager de la présence de Iman et du dialogue avec son traducteur favori, Richard Jacquemond. Merci à tous les deux, merci de votre écoute. Et donc, rendez-vous le 30 avril pour un prochain rendez-vous de cet atelier de recherche. Et bonne fin d'après-midi à vous.